Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time away from the Lions game to come to this unique presentation. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Cangany, who is, as I mentioned this morning in church, the great-granddaughter of our founders, Colin and Carolyn Campbell. She has two other VIPs with her today. Her mother, Lynn Cangany, is the great-great-granddaughter, and Dr. Cangany's daughter, Emma, is here, and she's the great-granddaughter. Dr. Cangany is, of course, not only a descendant of our church founders, but she is a history scholar, earning a PhD in history from the University of Michigan, published a book called Frontier Seaport about Detroit in the, 18th century. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Cangany.
Thank you. I am so touched and delighted and honored to be with you this afternoon to help you celebrate a tremendous milestone. And one of the things that is so remarkable about this congregation is your enduring pride in your origin story. 150 years on, you still remember and revere your history, and that is pretty amazing. So what I thought I would do today is set that origin story in its larger context to highlight the full impact of Colin and Caroline Campbell's work, the full legacy of it, and that legacy is service to others. So let's start at the beginning. Colin Campbell was born in Glasgow in June 1811, and we don't know much about his family or his formative years, except that his parents, John Campbell and Janet, or Jessie Garnick, were married on November 4th, 1804. John Campbell was a weaver. He'd been married previously. Colin had two older half-sisters, Margaret and Elizabeth, and we know that at least in their youth, the older girls teased their younger half-brother. The loss of their mother, plus a new stepmother, a new baby, must have been a lot for them to take in, made harder by the fact that Colin was the pride and joy of his mother, Jessie Garnick Campbell, her only child, born when she was 50. Whatever their social position in Glasgow, the blended family's fortunes changed in 1815 when Colin was just 4. John Campbell died. With 3 young children to raise and no income, Jessie Garnick Campbell turned to her brother, Henry Garnick, minister of Edinburgh's Canongate Kirk, to train up Colin for the ministry. However long Colin studied under his uncle's guidance, it did not last. In January 1820, Henry Garnick suddenly died in his carriage coming home from dinner. His nephew Colin was just 8.5 at the time. Colin's formal schooling came to an end soon after, although his children noted that over the course of his life, Colin remained a true book lover and collected a fine library comprising mostly historical, philosophical, and theological works. After his uncle's sudden death in 1820, Colin seems to have been apprenticed to a merchant in Glasgow, eventually learning enough about the trade to take over the business, selling tea, coffee, sugar, spices, and fancy fruits. His daughter later wrote, quote, "I wish I could make you see my father. He was of medium height with the kindest face imaginable. He had the clearest, bluest eyes filled with friendliness and what someone has called a pilgrim look." From a few scant sources, we catch glimmers of Colin's religious upbringing. Under his mother's influence and his uncle's tutelage, he grew up in the established Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church. His parents seem to have been married in that church in November 1804. At some point before his death, Colin's father fell out with Presbyterianism and switched over to the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church of Scotland had been formed in the early 19th century, breaking away from the Church of Scotland over its lack of military zeal. It was an evangelical denomination that put an even higher premium on the authority of the Bible and gave autonomy to the congregation. And this will become important for our purposes in a minute. So each Saturday morning, John Campbell would walk his wife and children to the Presbyterian Kirk, and that was probably St. George's Parish Church, which you see behind me. And then he would keep walking to attend services by himself at the Congregational Church around the corner on West Nile Street. So it's not hard to imagine that this religiously mixed childhood, however fleeting it was, encouraged Colin to be discerning about his beliefs and to be unafraid to speak out against or even leave orthodoxy for heterodoxy, to try on different denominations until he found just the right one. And that certainly would be the path that his adult life took. But in his youth, after his father died, after his uncle died, after his education died, so too did Colin's enthusiasm for church. Jesse Garnet Campbell never stopped praying that Colin would find his way back to religion, even when, as one source tells us, he became skeptically inclined. At the age of 20, in the midst of Glasgow's cholera epidemic, Colin returned to the fold, attending a preparatory church service, presumably at St. George's, with his mother on a Friday evening in 1831, with the idea that he would attend communion on Sunday with her. It proved a turning point in his life. After the service, mother and son sat up late talking together. She told him how her heart rejoiced over the step he had taken and how grateful she was that God had answered the prayer she had so often offered on his behalf. And now at last, when the answer had come, she felt like exclaiming in the words of the aged Simon, "Now, Lord, lettest thou thy ancient servant depart in peace, according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation." This was her last prayer, and it seemed to have been received an immediate answer, for soon after she retired, she was stricken with cholera, and before morning, her spirit had taken its departure. As Colin's daughter later put it, "Grandmother talked lovingly and joyously to my father on Friday evening. She died before morning, was buried on Saturday, and on Sunday, he was alone in the world." Just as Colin Campbell struggled with discerning the particulars of his faith, so too did a young woman named Caroline Lynn. Born into a family of weavers in a suburb of Glasgow in 1821, 10 years after Colin Campbell, she too grew up in the established Presbyterian church. By age 17, she was drawn to more evangelical denominations. In 1838, with her brother Alec, she was attending Methodist services. In 1839, she and Alec switched to Baptist services, convinced that only full immersion baptism, no mere sprinkling, would do. In 1840, this time without her brother, she fell in with the Disciples of Christ, walking 7 miles each way to attend services. When Caroline Lynn became a disciple in 1840, she met, among its members, Colin Campbell. It's unclear when he had become a disciple, but their courtship was swift and certain. They were married in the church in November of that year. And given what we know of them, it's not hard to surmise what they must have appreciated about each other: free thinking, deep faith, fortitude, industriousness, a love of learning, and compassion for the world. It's also not hard to imagine that Colin reminded Caroline of her older brother Alec, who had led the Lynns into evangelicalism. "My mother was a woman of strong intellect," the Campbell's daughter Tina wrote, "more stern and rigid in her beliefs than my father. She grew, however, more and more broad and mellow as the years wore on. She was grievously handicapped during a great part of her life by very poor sight, which made her appear perhaps a little less friendly than my father. The more one knew her, however, the more she was loved and honored. She seemed to know the Bible from beginning to end and could supply any word if one's reading to her when someone hesitated. She taught us all to read, using the Bible as her textbook. In spite of her poor sight, my mother was always busy. Sewing, we sometimes threaded 40 needles for her before going to school. Tending dearly loved plants, visiting the sick, comforting the afflicted, to doubters justifying the ways of God to man. She was a tower of strength. She had a keen sense of humor and a bright cheeriness. She was a great lover of children and a born diplomat in her dealings with them." The Disciples of Christ had been formed in 1832 and informed by the Second Great Awakening, that period of intense religious revivalism that swept the United Kingdom and the United States. So unlike the established Presbyterian Church, the Disciples were not Calvinist. They did not believe in predestination or in unconditional election. The Disciples of Christ denomination was established to restore Christianity to its original pure form, the form that the 12 apostles presumably had practiced. By returning to this first form, by stripping away all of these later false practices and distractions, disciples could not only restore Christianity to its true shape, but also hasten the second coming of Christ, because the second coming was dependent on a perfected world, a world that had to be perfected by the faithful. So evangelicals in this period were progressives, becoming active members in various political and social causes to fulfill their religious obligations and usher in Christ's return. So this set of religious beliefs, religious obligations, would go on to inform everything that the Campbells did after immigrating to the United States, from the social causes they supported, to the institutions they helped establish, to the way they conducted their daily lives. Everything they did was about serving others to help improve the world. Well, less than 2 years into their marriage, now with an infant son, John, Caroline Lynn and Colin Campbell determined to immigrate to the United States, and not just the family of 3. Also on the journey were Caroline's parents, all but one of Caroline's siblings, plus their spouses and children, and Colin Campbell's 3 roommates from his bachelor days. Colin Campbell paid for the fares of almost the entire group, which tells us not only about his bank account and his generosity, but also about his charisma. Family sources make plain that it was Colin who convinced them to immigrate. Setting out from Glasgow, the group planned to go to Illinois to take up farming. To us, this seems nonsensical. They had no farming experience among them. These were urban people. But that was probably part of the appeal, to own considerable land to live off of it. And undoubtedly, they were drawn to the idea of farming being honest work, laboring for God, community, and self in that order. It would have been an arduous journey to the United States, 12 or 14 weeks across the Atlantic Ocean in a sailing vessel to New York, a week up the Hudson River, 9 or 10 days on the Erie Canal, and 8 more days from Buffalo to Detroit. As the story goes, they arrived in Detroit at 3 a.m. on a Sunday in August 1842, with a brief layover before continuing on to Chicago. Well, in those days, Detroit had a population of less than 10,000. Among them were hundreds of Scots, many of whom had turned out to welcome the boat. This is hard for us to imagine. 3 o'clock in the morning, they're turning out to welcome the boat. So the Campbells and Lynns decided to make Detroit their home instead. And one source says that it was Caroline who made that decision, refusing to travel any further with a baby in arms. The group's farming plans were quickly abandoned, though as we'll see, this idea would manifest itself in a different way. Colin carried over his Glasgow business model to his new home, opening the Scotch store, which stocked foreign and domestic dry goods. And he had a range of business partners. First, one of his roommates from his bachelor days, then his brother-in-law, Thomas, then his sons, John and Forrest. But the concept was always the same: fancy dried fruits, tea, coffee, sugar, millinery, fabrics, embroideries, laces, shawls, belts. He stocked his merchandise from a Scottish firm in New York, which undoubtedly would have included Scottish wools, shawls, and thread. The Campbells initially settled on Catherine Street in what was then the outskirts of Detroit. And as Colin's business prospered and Detroit expanded, the family located further and further from city center, first to Congress Street and then to Randolph Street, just north of Gratiot, in a large white house with a triangular park in front. And this is where the Campbells spent most of their married life together. Where the house used to stand is now a Hilton Garden Inn. It's not far from the Detroit Opera House, but the triangular park that was in front of their house is still there. In all their homes, including on the Randolph Street home, the Campbells were known for their lavish entertaining. As their daughter wrote, quote, "Church socials, Sunday school entertainments, equal suffrage meetings, weddings of employees who had no homes of their own in which to celebrate, all of these were common occurrences." The Campbells enjoyed their good fortune with those around them, including their faith community. When the Campbells arrived in Detroit in 1842, there were only 6 people who identified as disciples of Christ, and they were all members of the Hawley family. The arrival of the Campbells and the Lynns doubled the congregation to 12, which meant for worship in the Hawley home. Despite a 30-year age difference, the Hawley patriarch, Thomas Hawley, then age 62, and Colin Campbell, age 31, were kindred spirits, sharing a similar vision for their growing church. They favored instrumental music and worship. the creation of a missionary society, collaborations with other denominations and other faith groups in service work, and other changes that many of the Lynns adamantly opposed. This difference of opinion ended up splitting the church and the family. In 1862, 20 years after arriving in Detroit, Colin Campbell, Thomas Hawley, and their followers broke away from the Lynns, forming their own congregation. 3 years later, the two factions partially reconciled before splitting into three groups: the Campbell group, the Lynn group, and the Hawley group. The Lynn group then filed a petition against the Campbell group, and Colin Campbell retaliated by excommunicating 11 of the 19 petition signers, including many of his wife's family members. As one historian has put it, quote, "Mr. Campbell did not judge these members unworthy of church membership at all, but simply did not wish to be personally associated with them in a congregational relationship on the ground of incompatibility of temper." Right? Thanksgiving would not have been easy, right? Eventually, the Lynn faction became the Plum Street Church, where MGM Grand's building now sits. The Campbell and the Hawley factions then merged, becoming Central Christian Church. Today it's Central Woodward Christian Church, which is located in Troy. Of this tumultuous time, Colin's daughter Tina noted simply, "He spent and was spent in its service." Well, these hot-blooded events were hard for later historians of the Plum Street Church to understand or accept, but they conceded, quote, "We are willing to believe they were honest men, true to their convictions, and did what they sincerely believed was right." This seems to fit Colin Campbell to a T. In 1881, 2 years before he died, Frank Lambie, a relative by marriage on the Lynn side, teased Colin in print about some of the personality traits that probably played into this schism. Quote, "He is a latitudinarian," which of course we know he wasn't, right? He was very particular about his denominations. He's a latitudinarian, free and literal in all things: cash, labor, sympathy, and especially the use of cold water. He drinks it, washes with it, cures diseases with it, and uses enormous quantities of it in baptisments. Just to put a fine point on it, he's talking about Colin having baptized new church members in Orchard Lake. His folks think that none are properly baptized unless immersed in cold water after they believe, and on this point they mass all their forces with the usual Campbellite determination. Lambie went on, "Colin Campbell does not approve of paid preachers and would not accept any pay for lessons given in that line any more than the master. He thinks these fashionable churches a hindrance rather than a help toward the diffusion of the gospel. His whole effort is to comfort and bless his fellow men, and he goes through the world like a band of music among ordinary pilgrims." His daughter Tina noted, "He was broad and liberal in his opinions, his mind open for truth from any quarter, and he had devoted friends of all creeds and political parties." One also suspects Caroline Campbell had a gentling effect on her husband's religious fervor. Their daughter Tina wrote of the estrangement between Uncle Alec Lynn and my father and mother. "When Uncle Alec died," she wrote, "his hand was in my mother's, in spite of church difficulties. He asked my mother to recite a hymn, I've forgotten which. My brother John used to say there was magic in her touch." In her own way, Caroline Campbell was a force. She was among the first to volunteer with Detroit's Protestant Orphan Asylum. She was a charter member for the Home for the Friendless and the Industrial School Association, which provided meals and vocational training to Detroit's poor children and still exists today. During the industrial school's modest beginnings, the charter members undertook much of the physical labor themselves, making and serving meals, bathing and clothing children. During the Civil War, she spent her winters rolling bandages and knitting for the Union soldiers, and her summers preparing jams, jellies, and dried fruit for wounded veterans. She was recognized for her war efforts during Lincoln's second inauguration in 1864, when she was named president of the Ladies' State Fair for the relief of destitute freedmen and refugees. At the fair's conclusion, she was given an autograph album containing the signatures of Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Edwin Stanton, and others. Her daughter Tina gave it to the Burton Historical Collection in the Detroit Public Library. You can go see it, but the most valuable signatures have been razored out. Colin Campbell was every bit the social activist as his wife. He shared some of her causes, serving on the boards of the Protestant Orphan Asylum and the Industrial School. He was a founding member of the St. Andrew's Society, which was a Scottish benevolent organization that still exists today. He volunteered with several religious organizations, including the Sabbath School County Convention, the State Christian Convention, the Wayne County Bible Society, and the Detroit branch of the Evangelical Alliance. He also fought hard for equality. He was the first vice president of the Women's Suffrage Association, and he was unable to hold the presidency because that had to go to a woman. He and his wife entertained in their home many of the women's rights movement's giants, including Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone. He was equally devoted to abolition, helping fugitive slaves, hiding them in his home, his barn, or any secret place until he could row them across the river to Windsor. As his daughter Tina put it, of course working for this Underground Railroad was unconstitutional, but he violated the Fugitive Slave Act in good company. As Frank Lambie, a relative by marriage, put it in a published tribute to Colin in 1881, quote, "There is no Scotchman in the state of Michigan better known or more universally respected. Mr. Campbell is honest, kind-hearted, and generous to a fault. He made money fast and gave it away faster. He has a wealth of heart that no man can give or take away. He has given half his time and more than half his earnings to the needy and the lonely-hearted. We can hear his hearty laugh 3 blocks away." I love that detail. "Although he has seen more sorrow than most men. A kind of private banker all the while, he took care of widows and orphans and broken-down people by the score." True to their original vision for settling in the United States, Colin and Caroline Campbell also liked to escape the noise and the dust and the grime and the busyness of the city. So in 1856, 14 years after arriving in Michigan, they purchased the land in the middle of the lake that we know now as Apple Island for $3,050. And it was designed to be a retreat for family and friends. They learned about it and acquired it through their Scottish network. It cannot be overstated how difficult the journey from Detroit to Orchard Lake would have been in the 1850s. Wagons loaded with belongings would have trundled out of the city on the Saginaw Trail, which in those days was a plank road. Once in Pontiac, they would have picked up Orchard Lake Road and then Commerce Road, unloaded at the bluffs overlooking the lake right off of Commerce today, and carrying everything down by hand to the water, which was then taken across by a scow, and you can see that image here. Oh, my pointer is not working. Let's see. Okay, well, it doesn't want to go backwards. There we go, thank you. Okay, so that's the scow there that's got the horse and the wagon on it. So the journey from Detroit to Orchard Lake would have taken 5 hours, maybe more. Once the house was set up, it was more common to come by train to Pontiac, about an hour's journey, which left only the 5-mile drive by wagon to the shore. In the center of the island, perched on the high ground, was the Campbells' house, a 1-story, red-roofed, white-clapboard structure started by the island's previous owners. The Campbells even inherited much of the furniture. Mostly this was a vacation home, although there was plenty of work to do, clearing roads, weeding gardens, drawing water, and building and maintaining structures. And there was also what one archaeologist has called hobby farming. The Campbells did much of this work themselves, although they did hire a farmer, particularly later in their lives. Under the farmer's hand in 1879, the island's 10 acres under cultivation yielded 5 tons of hay, 25 bushels of corn, 12 bushels of wheat, 20 bushels of potatoes, along with 50 apple trees, 8 peach trees, and a grape arbor. They also had livestock, 2 horses, 2 milk cows that produced 160 pounds of butter, 9 pigs, 95 domesticated fowl, which produced some 200 eggs. They made hardly any money from this venture, just $100 after the farmer's wages were deducted. In addition to being a vacation home for family and friends, the island also served as a respite for those in need. Professor Charles Lewis Lose, a professor of ancient languages and later the president of what's now Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, he spent many a summer at Apple Island as a guest of the Campbells and also as the church's seasonal minister. Lose wrote of Caroline Campbell, quote, "For years she was wont to bring the afflicted and sorrowful, especially women, to enjoy the quiet, restful comfort and delight of this charming retreat. And here they met a kindness that was a fragrant balm to their spirits." Well, just as in their home in Detroit, the Campbells had daily family worship in the island, in their front parlor of their home. The only sources we have about this daily practice come from the Campbells' granddaughter, Carrie Harvey, after Colin Campbell had died. So you will note that this passage, that he's conspicuously absent from it. Carrie Harvey remembered, quote, "As we filed into the room, every other entrant took both a Bible and a hymn book. There was a rivalry among us as to who should have the choice seats on the sofa." And that's the sofa in the picture there that they would have been sitting on. From there, one had a fine view of the garden, the fields beyond, the lake and the opposite shore, and one often would have much preferred to be nearer those scenes than in Grandma Campbell's parlor. When Grandma Campbell took her seat in the large mahogany rocker, it was time for worship to begin. We each read a verse beginning with a psalm and then a chapter in the New Testament. Counting from the person who read the first verse, it was easy to count up and to study the verse which should come to us, as none of us were facile readers. Sometimes it happened that someone read 2 verses and giggles followed. If any attempted to skip a verse, Grandma Campbell clearly recited the omitted verse with decided emphasis. The Bible reading was followed by a prayer. All kneeled by their chairs. If there were no distinguished guests, either Grandma Campbell or Mama prayed. The prayer was followed by singing an old familiar hymn to an old familiar tune, usually a long meter, and the hymn singing dragged on for some time. The memories of these simple, wholehearted services helped many who later wandered far away from home influence. Well, in addition to daily morning worship, there was also a longer service on Sundays. And in addition to that, the Campbells also had an evensong service on the front porch just after dinner on Sunday nights. The family would gather together facing the lake as the sun was setting for hymn sing. So instead of the reserved, solemn hymns of the morning, evensong featured the jubilant, gospel-like hymns of church revivals and camp meetings, evangelical music straight out of the Second Great Awakening. This transition from the formal to the euphoric mirrors in some ways the evolution of the Campbells' own religious practices. The evensong tradition continued each summer Sunday night until Caroline Campbell's death in May of 1900. As the community around Orchard Lake continued to grow, it became increasingly less practical for all the residents to gather in the Campbell house for Sunday services, or to hop the train with her back to Detroit. Thus, in 1871, Colin and Caroline Campbell initiated plans for building a church on the mainland, this church. The Campbell's daughter, Tina, recorded, and note all the references to serving others in this passage. Quote, "My parents felt that it was their duty to provide a place of worship, hence this chapel. I know my father was as interested in it as my mother, and yet it always seems it was my mother's chapel, perhaps because she was here so many years after his death. She had been in the habit of driving into Detroit to attend church services whenever it was possible, but it did not satisfy her, for she could not take all of the islanders with her, and she greatly desired for them and for her friends and her neighbors on the shore the same privileges that she enjoyed." The building of the chapel was in every way a community project. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my... It only wants to go forward, which is curious. Here we go. Okay. All right, we'll see if it catches up. The building of this chapel was in every way a community project, and the considerable efforts to complete it cannot be overstated. Peter Dow, whose wife had formerly been married to Colin Campbell's first business partner, he was the one who gave an acre of land for it. The Campbells' future son-in-law, architect Henry T. Brush, drew up the chapel's plans. The cornerstone was laid in October 1871, so it would take nearly 3 years to complete the building on July 18, 1874, and that was paid for through the community's efforts. Caroline Campbell grew and sold grapes from the island to raise funds. Mrs. Dickey, Mrs. Greer, and Mrs. Cuthbertson each gave $100 toward the chapel's cost. William Williams, who was visiting the Campbells from Wales, gave the communion table. Annie Ellis gave the communion service. Jessie Blackie Lynn gave the big Bible. Mrs. Seeley from New York gave a Bible cushion. Caroline Campbell's mother, Jean Ralston Lynn, gave the communion tablecloths. The Campbell's daughter, Jeannie, and her husband gave the stained glass window. Jeannie's sister, Jessie, and her husband gave the paint and varnish. The pulpit and the melodeon came from the Campbells' Detroit church. The Campbells paid for the minister while they were financially able to do so, and when they weren't, many other ministers gave of their time freely to sustain the congregation, to, as Caroline Campbell used to say, keep the Lord's banner from trailing in the dust. As you will have gathered by now, throughout the entirety of his life, Colin Campbell's prospects rose brilliantly and crashed spectacularly in an incredible cycle of change. On February 5th, 1858, 18 months after purchasing Apple Island, the Scotch store caught fire and burned. Not completely. My guess is that this photo was taken after the fire because you can see some smoke damage to the roof. Right above that vent there, and then there's also some damage in the back. But the damage was significant enough that Campbell moved the business to a new location at the northwest corner of Woodward and Congress Streets, about where the Chase Tower sits now. He rebuilt the business, and he did incredibly well, so well that in around 1870, he and Caroline sold their Randolph Street home and purchased the Duffield Mansion at the northwest corner of Woodward and High, and this is now Woodward where the Fisher Service Drive is. And they split the cost, and they shared the home with their daughter and son-in-law, Jesse and John Harvey. John Harvey was a prominent pharmacist. It was a significant step up for both families, but it didn't last long for the Campbells. If you keyword search Scotch store in the digitized Detroit newspapers that exist online, you will find a whole catalog of customers' unpaid accounts, outright thefts of store merchandise, lawsuits, countersuits, all embroiling Colin Campbell in endless difficulties in being paid for his work and in turn paying others. His business weathered most of the storms, but the financial panic of 1873 pulled the business under. Starting as a stock market crash in Europe, the run soon spread to American railroad companies and financial institutions. More than 100 U.S. banks failed. All this was happening while they were also trying to fundraise to complete the church. The stress must have been tremendous. Colin Campbell held on for nearly a year before closing his business on August 18, 1874, 1 month to the day after the church was complete. He should have been entering retirement. Instead, he was starting over. Colin came straight to the island to break the news to Caroline. "Well, Mother," he told her, "I'm 63 years old and I have 63 cents in my pocket." Their daughter Tina recalled, "Mother said to him, 'Well, Colin, we don't have to come down, for we never held ourselves up.'" It was a beautiful moonlit night, Tina recalled, and we were all sitting on the front porch, a number of us, and my sister Jeannie, who was very ill, was propped up with pillows in the large parlor rocking chair. When Father unexpectedly joined us on the porch, he told of his loss, and Jeannie impulsively rose and threw her arms around his neck and held her head on his shoulder, kissed him many times and cried, "Oh, Papa, it doesn't matter what you have lost if we are just all left to one another." I can see the awed group sitting in the moonlight as if it were today. A month from that day, she passed on. At age 20, dying of typhoid fever, 5 months after she gave birth to her daughter Annie. So do you see the timeline here? On July 18th, the church was finished. On August 18th, the business failed. On September 18th, Jeannie died. Hers was the church's first funeral. The loss of Jeannie was devastating to the Campbell family. Family sources say Colin in particular never got over her loss. His biographer noted simply, quote, "For a time he was nearly distracted with grief. But shortly his faith and courage triumphed, and he rose to the situation, entered the fire insurance business, and for 7 years struggled on and succeeded wonderfully well." What that biographer does not mention is that to pay the debts from the loss, Colin and Caroline Campbell sold everything, including their half of the Duffield house, and downsized, first to a house on Columbia Street, and then to a house at the northwest corner of West Montcalm Park, all to hang on to Apple Island. It worked, but even as late as 1878, 22 years after purchasing the island, they still owed half their mortgage on it. There was something else that gave meaning and joy to Colin and Caroline's life in this period, and that was their granddaughter Annie, Jeannie's daughter. Just 5 months old when her mother died and she was unable to be cared for by her father, as a baby she was adopted by her maternal grandparents who doted on her. Annie was her grandmother's last pupil, learning to read the Bible just like her mother's aunts and uncles had. And at the age of 7, she finished reading aloud the entire New Testament. Following their near bankruptcy, over the next 7 years, Colin and Caroline Campbell worked to rebuild, eking out a living, supporting their causes, getting the Orchard Lake Chapel off and running. No longer able to pay the minister's wages, Colin Campbell assumed many of those responsibilities himself. On a Sunday in late summer 1881, he was presiding at the communion table in the chapel when he suffered a fatal heart attack. Another congregant, Frank D. Taylor, rushed forward to finish the service while Colin was transported back to the island, where he lingered for several days. The Campbells' daughter, Tina, recorded, "He said to my mother a few days before his death, 'Ma, I have had a long struggle with my quick temper, and now as I lie dying, I can just feel it under control.'" And that certainly seems to have been true. We have seen how passionate he was about his beliefs and ideas. Now here's the next part. "But I can lay my hand on my heart and say, I never spoke a vulgar word nor told a vulgar story." Well, this sentiment is a little hard for us to understand in 2023 because we would attach more significance to the regulating of the emotions part. But I think what this tells us is that this was a self-made man whose net worth was probably several times what his parents had been. What he would have longed for, what he would have called respectability, right? High moral standing, honorability, the manners of a gentleman, even when he didn't have the bank account to match. Those traits were very important to him. And so I think that's what he's getting at in the vulgarity piece. Certainly the tributes and eulogies that flowed in after his death confirmed that that's how his peers viewed him. John Thompson, one of his roommates from Glasgow, wrote some years later, "Your father was the purest man I ever met." Thompson named one of his sons Colin Campbell Thompson in honor of his former roommate. William G. Brownlee, who had immigrated to Detroit alongside the Campbells in 1842, wrote a tribute to Colin and appeared in the Evening News. Quote, "There is no man in the state wider known or better loved than Colin Campbell. He gave his life to humanity, even to excess, and more than half of his time was given to the widow, the orphan, and the destitute. His proper motto would be, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich, having nothing and yet possessing all things." In a Detroit Tribune tribute, an essayist noted that Colin's sincere and unaffected piety none doubted who ever knew him. He was not demonstrative or ostentatious, but in the quiet and steadfast adherence to his belief and his principles, and in the faithful discharge of every duty, there was never a question as to where he was to be found. Nor did the reverses that overtook him later in life weaken his faith or sour his spirit. He was still the same calm, even-tempered man as in more fortunate days, perhaps with something more of patience visible in his pleasant face and a quieter tone in his customary speech. The burden of life well and patiently borne is laid down at last. The kingdom is reached where they never grow weary or old. Colin had funerals both here at the chapel and at his disciples' church on Washington Avenue in Detroit. Caroline Campbell carried on without him for another 17 years, continuing to devote herself to the same causes that she had for decades before dying at her home at 46 West Montcalm of chronic gastritis. Charles Lewis Lose, a close personal friend and the seasonal first minister here, wrote the following tribute to her. "I have known this noble woman since 1858. She and her husband walked in the commandments and ordinances of God blamelessly. I have seldom known two people more completely devoted in all their life to the interests and causes of Christ, and in the largest way, as far as their utmost ability reached, to the highest good of their fellow beings. Caroline was a zealous, ever-active institution of mercy herself, and all this without the least desire to be known in her deeds of benevolence." Detroit's mayor, William C. Maybury, added, "This city, so long her home and the recipient of gracious words and deeds, will cherish her memory and be enriched by the influence of her splendid example for generations to come. At rest from her labors, her works do follow her." And that remains true even today. Happy 150th OLCCP. Thank you. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have, so feel free to ask. Christy. Happy to do that. We'll see if it's working now. All right. That's the way of it, isn't it? Okay. Let's back up here. This one? Okay. So let's start in the back row. So the older woman with the baby on her lap, so that's Caroline Campbell, and she's holding her grandson, Colin. Next to her in the back is her daughter, Jessie Campbell Harvey, who also had a house on the island and was very instrumental in the early days of the church. In the row in front of them, there's a woman sitting with her back to the pillar in a light-colored dress. That is Annie, the adopted granddaughter. Next to her to the right, a woman in a dark dress. Here, that's the Campbells. No, excuse me. That is Carrie Harvey. So that is Jessie's daughter, her oldest. So Carrie Harvey with the puffed sleeve. Her brother John is leaning with his tie kind of askew. That's her brother John. Tina is on the far right in the second row with the white shirt and the black kind of heavy shoulders there. That's Tina. The man with the cap on the left, that's Forrest Campbell. So that's Colin and Caroline's other son, Forrest. Behind him, sitting on the far left, is his wife, Toni. That's their daughter, Alma, who's at Forrest's knee. I believe that is the dog that came into church one Sunday morning, got left behind on the island, swam all the way, burst through the doors, and was, sopping wet. And Jessie, who was playing at the organ at the time, was, quite astonished. There's her dog. And I think he's Rex, but I will look into that. Campbell Harvey, Jessie Campbell Harvey's youngest child, Campbell, is sitting next to the dog, and he's got the floppy white collar on. His older sister, Alice, has the braid over the shoulder. That's my great-grandmother. And then I'm not sure who the woman sitting next to Alice is. I think that's a family friend. Yeah, but basically it's all Campbells and their descendants. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. It is Montcalm Street in Detroit, yes. So they would have been, some people like to say under, second base at Comerica-ish. Yeah, it's interesting that all their houses in Detroit are gone. Now Jessie and John Harvey's house still exists in Detroit. It's now the Inn at Winder Street, 97 Winder Street. It's a bed and breakfast. It is an enormous house. At one time, it was the largest home in Detroit. That is still there, which you can see. But all the houses that the Campbells lived in, with the exception of the foundation on the island, are all gone. Yeah, Gordy. Yes, so the Campbell's daughter, Jeannie, the one who died at 20, was married to Henry Brush, who was the architect here. He was a very prominent architect, young architect in his day, and there are a number of buildings of his that are still standing. He did quite a lot of Hillsdale College and a lot of local things also, but you can Google it. There is a database of Henry Brush structures still in existence. Yeah? Yes? Oh, lovely. Okay, well, first of all, if you find anything, let me know, because I have not done that research trip yet, and I'm desperate to do it, so let me know. I would start with the Presbyterian churches, and I don't know which one, but I would probably start with the St. George's Parish, because that was right around the corner from the Congregational Church. So if they're walking, right, it's got to be close. So I would start at St. George's and see what you can find in the kirkyard or in the records, because they're not online. So I would start there for them. The Lynns were from Paisley, which is now a suburb of Glasgow, and there was a Baptist church there, a Methodist church there, still is there's an abbey there, so you certainly can look to those things. But I don't know. There are no addresses. There are no census records. So I think the churches are your best bet. Yeah. I don't know about golf. I also don't know about curling, which, the Scottish community here started, and supposedly it's the first place curling was done in the US on Orchard Lake. So I'd love to believe he was a curler. Peter Dow, who gave the land for the church, he was a curler. So it's not outside the realm of possibility, but I don't know. Yeah. Yes? That's a great question. So as far as I have been able to determine on any of the existing census records, the Campbells did not have live-in servants. Not to say that they wouldn't have outsourced that labor. Their daughter and son-in-law, the Harveys, certainly did have live-in help. And when you see this house in Detroit, you will understand that they needed help, because it is a huge house to have maintained. Certainly there was a farmer that was hired and lived on the island year-round. He was the one that was overseeing those 10 acres under cultivation. He had a family with young children who also helped on the island. There are some interesting photos of that. But as far as I know, no servants. Yeah, certainly could have been helping with labor, but not living in the house, as far as I can determine. Yeah. Yes. Ooh, how many houses were on the island? I would say probably 10-ish. So the Campbell house is the original one, probably started by two owners before the Campbells, and then at some point the kitchen and dining room were put on the back, but it would have just been that little, 2 or 4 room house to start. Their children, Forrest and Jesse, had their own houses on the island. Their friends, the Devendorfs, had what were called tents, but they were sort of cedar shake-sided structures. So there's that. There's the King house, which is Annie's house after she married. She and her family built a house there. There was a duplex that was shared by Charles Lewis Lose's children and some relatives, and I think there were like a couple more, so like 9 or 10, I would say, altogether. And then the Ward house, which is later. Willis Ward built his house after he took ownership of the island in 1922, built this lovely house. It was struck by lightning, it burned, and that's why it's somewhat in the shape that it's in now. I have only ever found one photo of the Ward house, which is in the Bentley Library at U of M, and it was a glass plate negative, and it's taken from way far away, and you can zoom in and just see that really blurry little, suggestion of a White House, but that's it. But that is it. Yeah. Now maybe something exists in Ward papers that are still, in the family's holdings, but that is the only thing I've ever found. Yeah. Were those just summer homes, or did they live year-round? So that's a great question. Mostly these are summer homes, although there are stories of the farmer's family living year-round one time. And there also is this really excellent story that has come down to us. Aunt Jeanette was a younger sister of Caroline Campbell, Jeanette Lynn. She was one of the families that came over in 1842. She and her family settled in Detroit, and they had a house on Green Lake. So one winter, Caroline and Jeanette's mother, Jean Ralston Lynn, was wintering on the island. Don't know who was with her, but this was towards the end of her life. And her daughter Jeanette and a friend of Jeanette's decided to visit her on the island this winter. And it was almost spring thaw, and there was open water. They took off their jewelry and their fur coats and left them on the shore. They had tapping sticks, and they walked very gingerly, and the woman who writes the story says she could hear the running water on either side as they were tapping their way to the island. They made it. They got all the way there, knocked on the door. Jean Ralston Lynn opened the door and said, "You're late. I've had dinner waiting for you. You're late." And apparently Aunt Jeanette responded, "Well, Mother, I have all the more appetite for it now." But other than that, seasonal with a couple of exceptions. Yeah. Yes? Yes. Beats me. Beats me. I don't know. It would be lovely to imagine that there must be some connection, but I don't know. That is, for future research. Yes. Yeah. What was that minister's first name? Sarah. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, TBD. Yes. Yes, exactly. So that was their primary church, but when they were here, this was the church that they went to. Yeah. But before 1874, I get the sense that sometimes on Sundays they were going back to church services at their Detroit church before this was open for services. But yeah, mostly they would have gone to that church. But it's so interesting that their daughter Tina, who is the record keeper in the family, we know 90% of this because of Tina. And that's true for the early history of the church, for the Campbells, for Apple Island. That is all Tina's documentation. And it's so interesting that she really does not talk about that church at all. This is the church that she talks about. Yeah. In fact, I didn't know anything about the excommunication, the schisms, nothing. That doesn't come from her. She had this cryptic passage about, about Uncle Alec's hand having been in her mother's hand. I thought, what the heck is that about? So that was all she had to say about it. But this very much was her church home, not Detroit, which is interesting. Yeah. Yes. So when they're on the island, I don't know about when Colin Campbell was alive, because all the records for church services that have come down to us are post-1883, so he was already gone by that point. It's hard to imagine that he wouldn't have had a big role in those services. I mean, just given his temperament and the importance that he felt in it, and all the ministering that he did do in a lay capacity. I can't imagine that he would not have, but we don't know. Mm-hmm. Yes?
When they sang the hymns there on the island, whether they had any kind of instrumental accompaniment at all, or was it just all?
That's a great question. So what instruments did they have? In their home, they had two pianos. They had a upright in their front parlor and an upright I think there's a melodeon at some point that's in there, isn't that right, Mom? Yeah, in the back parlor. So I would imagine those would have accompanied, certainly the piano in the front parlor would have. The hymn sing on the front steps, as far as I can determine, was a cappella. Wow. Oh, I would love to see it. Yeah. Cool. Oh, wow. Wow, those are treasures. How cool. How cool. Oh, okay. So Gordy, would you say it again? Here, you want to come up here?
Hard act to follow. About 20 years ago, I was rummaging around in a filing cabinet upstairs, and I happened to find some letters from Carolyn Campbell's daughter, who was also named Carolyn. And along with those was a bill of materials for the church. And it was about $5,000 to build it back in 1871 to 1874. And I just mentioned that during the painting project, they uncovered a piece underneath the porch. It was added in 1947, but a little further back, we found 2 hand-hewn square nails. So I said we should give some to the Cangany family. You know, it's an heirloom. That was it, sorry.
Okay, thank you. This has been so much fun. Thank you very much.